Welcome to The Deep Dive. Today, we are plunging into, well, a really challenging idea. One that pushes back pretty hard against something most of us just take for granted.
Hmm.
We're looking at an article from the Academy of Ideas, and it draws heavily on Rolf Dobelli's book, Stop Reading the News.
Right.
So our mission in this deep dive is to really unpack the core argument presented here, which is basically the idea that consuming news isn't just a waste of time, but could actually be actively harmful.
Yeah, it's a strong claim. We're going to explore why this material makes such a provocative statement, try to pull out the key insights, and look at the practical suggestions it offers for you.
Exactly. So this deep dive is all about trying to understand this particular perspective, this idea that news consumption is like mental junk food.
And how that might be impacting your mind, maybe your well-being, and even how you interact with the world around you. We're really just stepping into the argument as it's laid out in this source material.
Okay, so let's just get right into it.
Cool.
The core provocation right from the start. It's pretty blunt, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. News, it argues, is to the mind what sugar is to the body.
Yeah.
It's enticing, seems easy to consume.
But ultimately, toxic,
Yeah.
at least within this framework they're presenting.
Toxic. Sets a really strong tone immediately.
It does. And the contention is that far from making us more informed citizens, daily news consumption actually, well, it fosters ignorance, it breeds helplessness,
Ignorance, helplessness. Cool.
it feeds intolerance, and it actively erodes focus and well-being. I mean, these are significant claims.
Definitely.
And the material then dives into the supposed mechanisms behind how this actually happens.
So let's dig into that mental junk food idea a bit more then. Why that specific comparison? Why sugar?
Well, the parallel being drawn is really about stimulation versus substance, Like sugar, daily news is designed to be highly stimulating,
Grabs your attention.
constantly grabbing for your attention with novelty, with urgency. But the argument goes, it's largely nutritionally void for your mind.
It specifically appeals to our innate negativity bias. We know bad news is inherently more attention-grabbing, and it caters perfectly to, well, ever-shortening attention spans.
Yeah, that makes sense. And there's also the point made that this pattern of consumption, it can become addictive.
Exactly. That's a key part of the argument.
Yeah.
It's described as addictive, keeping us focused purely on the short term, constantly reacting, and being emotionally destabilized without building genuine understanding or providing, useful context. It's presented as this cycle of shallow, high-intensity engagement.
Right. Now, here's where it got really interesting for me, the connection they draw between news and helplessness. The material talks about learned helplessness.
Yes, this is a concept rooted in psychology, famously illustrated by experiments like those by Seligman and Mayer with rats back in the day.
Okay.
Those studies basically show that when animals were repeatedly exposed to stressful situations they couldn't escape from, they eventually just became passive. They stopped trying to change their circumstances. And some studies suggested they even lost the capacity for pleasure, a state called anhedonia.
And the argument connects this directly to the constant influx of news we get.
That's the parallel being drawn, yes.
Yeah.
The idea is that constant exposure to overwhelming global crises and events, reported daily things you personally have very little or no direct control over.
Like huge economic shifts or distant wars.
Exactly. Things like that.
Right.
It's likened to that inescapable stress from the experiments. It can lead, the argument goes, to a similar kind of mental paralysis, a feeling of powerlessness, reduced motivation, and ultimately a sort of passive stance toward the very issues being reported. So instead of spurring constructive action, the claim is it can induce this state of, like, frozen anxiety.
That's a really powerful and, frankly, kind of heavy idea. But it does resonate a bit with that feeling sometimes, being bombarded and just not knowing what to do with it all.
Right. And this ties straight into the next point raised in the material, what he called the illusion of understanding.
Illusion of understanding, okay.
The perspective offered is that the world is incredibly complex. It's messy, it's interconnected in ways that are hard to grasp.
It certainly feels that way most days.
Yeah. Yet daily news, just by its nature and format, short articles, quick broadcasts, it tends to reduce these complex events into really simple narratives or sound bites.
Like a headline.
Exactly. A simple example given might be something like, the market fell because of X. The material argues this is basically a fictional oversimplification.
Because in reality,
events like market movements usually result from a massive confluence of thousands, maybe millions, of interacting factors, not just one simple X.
So those neat, simple explanations we read in the news make us feel like we understand what's happening.
Wow.
But according to this view, we really don't get the full picture at all.
Precisely. These simplified stories can create an illusion of understanding that, paradoxically, might actually hinder genuine critical thinking.
How so?
Because you think you grasp the why, when you've really only been given a very superficial, maybe even potentially misleading, fragment of the actual situation.
Okay, that makes sense. And adding another layer of complexity here, the material makes a pretty strong claim about bias, doesn't it?
Oh, it really doesn't pull any punches on this.
Yeah.
The assertion is that most news just isn't neutral.
Right.
It suggests influences from, well, political agendas, corporate sponsorships, even government pressures are constantly at play behind the scenes. A striking point made is that behind every journalist, there are often multiple PR specialists actively working to shape the narratives that eventually reach us, the public.
That sounds quite cynical, but I guess it's a perspective worth considering, especially with the modern media landscape. It feels plausible in some ways.
Well, the conclusion drawn in the source material is that what the public often consumes is information that's been filtered and framed.
Filtered and framed.
Yeah, in ways that serve various interests,
Yeah.
which aren't necessarily about presenting pure objective reality. It even frames it as something that can function like propaganda, even if it's not always, intentionally malicious on an individual reporter's level.
Wow. Okay, so if we're potentially getting simplified, filtered, and biased information, how does the material suggest that impacts us socially as a society?
It's argued that it contributes to cultivating a kind of intellectual arrogance and also social polarization.
How does that work?
By giving us those quick, simple takes on really complex issues, news can convince us that we're informed on, well, everything. You read a headline, you feel like you get it.
Right.
This can lead people to quickly form, and then strongly hold, opinions on a huge range of issues that maybe they only understand superficially.
That definitely feels like something you see playing out constantly, especially online these days. The strong opinions based on headlines.
Exactly. And this illusion of knowledge, according to this view, is directly linked to negative social outcomes. Things like decreased tolerance for different perspectives, increased polarization.
Us versus them thinking.
Yeah, and fostering what's described as hateful or just unproductive discourse, which gets massively magnified on social media platforms. The material even contrasts this sort of rapid opinion culture with the wisdom of figures like Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic emperor,
Stoics again.
who advised, reserving judgment until you've truly understood something deeply, which is pretty much the opposite of the instant reaction loop that news often encourages.
So it's not just potentially making us feel helpless or ill-informed. This perspective argues it's also making us more prone to conflict with each other.
That's the argument presented, yeah. And the claims go even further still, connecting news consumption to a physical impact on our brains and our ability to focus.
Okay, tell me more about that. An actual physical impact sounds pretty significant.
It does. The material points to findings from sources like Pew Research, and it mentions neuroscience studies. The really striking claim made is that higher news consumption is correlated with a lower density of neurons
Fewer brain cells.
in a specific brain region.
Yeah.
It's called the anterior cingulate cortex.
And what does that part of the brain do? Why is that important?
Well, it's understood to be a key center for things like focus, sustained attention, impulse control, and even aspects of moral reasoning.
Focus and impulse control.
Wow. So the argument being made is that what's presented as a kind of news addiction could be actively rewiring our brains, potentially reducing our capacity for the sustained, deep thought that's required for things like, say, reading a complex book or concentrating for long periods on difficult tasks.
Wow. Suggesting it could be shrinking the part of your brain linked to focus and impulse control. That is a really serious assertion being made here.
It is a very strong claim, and it ties directly into another major theme in the material news as a potent stress engine.
Ah, the stress factor. I think many people can relate to that.
Right. The perspective is that news inherently exacerbates anxiety because its focus is so often on crises, violence, pandemics, economic instability, climate change disasters.
Scary stuff sells.
And these are often large, abstract threats that, again, are largely outside of our direct personal control, which feeds back into that helplessness idea.
And is there specific research cited connecting news consumption directly to stress levels?
Yes, the material mentions research, citing examples like studies from Sussex University, which apparently show a direct link between the amount of news people consume and higher levels of daily anxiety and stress.
A direct link.
That's what's claimed.
Yeah.
And the material includes a very powerful quote attributed to Rolf Dobelli himself on this point. News is making us sick.
News is making us sick. That's a very strong, very impactful statement.
It is.
Okay, so considering all these claimed harms, fostering ignorance, breeding helplessness, fueling intolerance, damaging focus, increasing stress, maybe even altering our brain structure, what is the bold solution proposed by this perspective? It seems like they must have one.
They do.
Yeah.
And Dobelli's prescription, as presented in the material, is quite radical, really.
Which is
Stop consuming news completely.
completely just cold turkey, like zero news intake.
That is the core recommendation put forward, yes.
Yeah.
The suggestion is to try maybe a 30-day experiment, complete abstinence from news, and just observe the potential effects on yourself.
What effects might someone look for?
Things like potentially reduced stress, maybe clearer thinking, perhaps improved decision-making, sharpened focus. That's the hypothesis.
And what if someone tries this 30-day thing and, slips up, sees a headline?
The advice given is to treat it like a detox process. If there's a relapse, you just reset and restart the experiment from day one. No big deal, just try again. And the material notes that Dobelli himself claims to have maintained this zero-tolerance approach for something like a decade.
Wow, 10 years. Okay, so if the recommendation is this radical stop consuming news entirely, how does this perspective suggest you stay informed about the world or engage with important issues? You can't just bury your head in the sand, can you?
No, and the material addresses that. The suggested alternatives are formats that provide, crucially, deeper context, richer depth, and more nuance.
Like what specifically?
This means turning to things like books, long-form investigative articles, maybe well-researched documentaries, academic journals, or other kinds of long-form content. Stuff that requires and rewards sustained attention.
Okay. And what's the perceived advantage of those formats over the daily news cycle, according to this view?
Well, the argument is that these alternatives provide a much more genuine, deeper understanding of global and societal issues.
Understanding versus just knowing.
Precisely. And crucially, they require and actually train your mind for resilience and for sustained, complex thought, which is argued to be the complete opposite of the effect of the fragmented, sort of dopamine-driven hit you get from daily news.
Right.
The idea is they build true insight, rather than just superficial, often quickly outdated awareness.
That distinction makes a lot of sense, the difference between knowing a headline and really understanding a topic. But, okay, there's a very common and important counterpoint to this whole stop the news idea, isn't there?
There is.
The accountability question. How do you hold people in power accountable if you're deliberately not paying attention to what they're doing day to day via the news?
That's a crucial question, absolutely. And the material addresses it head on. The response offered is, well, historical.
Yeah.
It points out that major historical transformations,
Like what?
like the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the European Revolutions of 1848, even the fall of the Soviet Union,
Yeah.
all occurred without modern news media as we understand it today. No 24-hour cable news, no Twitter feeds.
That's true. So what fueled those movements then, according to this perspective, if not daily news?
The argument presented is that they were driven by deeper forms of engagement, things like pamphlets, influential books, robust public debates, face-to-face discussions, and localized community organizing.
So deeper engagement, not just passive consumption.
Exactly. The conclusion drawn here is that significant social change doesn't actually come from passively consuming headlines day after day. It arises from active thinking, from seeking deeper understanding, from meaningful dialogue with others, from organizing, and from taking real, concrete action.
That's a really powerful framing, that the depth of engagement matters much more than the sheer volume of information consumed, especially when it comes to driving actual change.
And this leads us nicely to the final sort of overarching thought presented in the material, which brings in the wisdom of the Stoic philosopher Epictetus.
Epictetus again. Okay, I think I know this one. Some things are in our control and others are not. That foundational Stoic idea.
That's the one. Exactly. The material uses this principle to argue that by consciously choosing to abstain from the daily news cycle,
You choosing to focus.
you free up a tremendous amount of mental and emotional energy. Energy that was previously being spent reacting to, worrying about, maybe feeling helpless regarding things largely outside your direct personal control.
Distant global crises, political dramas you can't influence.
Sensational events happening far away.
Yeah.
All that stuff that fills the news, but you can't personally change.
And the idea is then you redirect that saved energy.
Precisely. You redirect it towards focusing intensely on what is within your sphere of control and influence.
Which would be?
Things like your own health, your personal habits, your relationships with people around you, your work, contributing meaningfully in your local community, taking concrete action in your own life where you can make a difference.
Right. Focusing on your circle of influence.
Exactly. The argument is that this focus is not only healthier for you as an individual, reducing that stress and anxiety, but ultimately it's also a more effective way to navigate the world and actually make a real tangible impact.
So pulling this whole perspective together then, derived from this source material, it presents a really compelling, although definitely challenging, case against our sort of default mode of daily news consumption.
Yeah, it really does.
Framing it as something potentially quite detrimental to our cognitive function, our emotional state, our capacity for genuine understanding, and even our ability to take effective action.
It really positions news as a form of mental pollution, doesn't it? Echoing that quote from Rolf Dobelli cited in the material. The news is mental pollution. Keep your brain clean.
That's a memorable line. Keep your brain clean.
And the takeaway from this viewpoint seems to be that the genuinely important things, the stuff that truly affects your life and your community, will likely still reach you through other means eventually.
Through conversation, through deeper reading.
Right. But the clarity of mind, the reduction in stress, the regained focus you might get from abstaining, those are presented as profoundly valuable gains, worth protecting.
This deep dive into the source material certainly challenges us to fundamentally reconsider our relationship with information, how we consume it, why we consume it.
It absolutely does.
And it leaves you with a pretty provocative thought, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Based on this perspective we've explored, is that constant stream of daily news truly making you more informed in a useful, actionable way?
Or is it primarily serving as a distraction, a source of stress, maybe distracting you from what truly matters in your life and what you can actually influence in your own world, your own immediate surroundings?
Yeah, that's certainly something to ponder long after this deep dive is over.